Doug first attended the CTO Summit here as an attendee, because you used to be at Envision.
That's right, 2 years ago.
That's great. And then you joined Zapier. And actually, my first question was going to be, can you clarify once and for all, Zapier or Zapier?
Yeah, so it's Zapier. Zapier makes you happier is the tagline to remember. I found out this morning from Adam from Frame.io that that British pronunciation is Zapier. So there you go. We just did it correctly. The founders are not British, but that's how we know we're saying it right.
Excellent. And it's Doug or Doog?
It depends on what country you're from, actually.
Fair enough. All right, so we're going to spend a lot of time exploring fully distributed teams, but I think as we go through the topics, there's going to be a lot of lessons that you can apply even to co-located teams, and we're going to try to get really deep, specific, and tactical. So, Doug, thank you. To start things off, can you just give a little bit of a personal background and talk about how you ended up at Zapier?
Sure. So my background's electrical engineering. I've been working up and down the hardware-software stack most of my career. So if you think IoT devices, that's kind of my skill set. I've been doing executive leadership for about 5 years now, so for not too long, and I'm still learning a lot about it. And my first executive position was at SimpliSafe, which is mic issues here. My first executive position was at SimpliSafe, and I built their first engineering team from scratch, and then went to Envision and ran product there for a couple of years. Did a small stint at a larger company, which reminded me that I love startups, and then landed at Envision after that.
That's great. And raise your hand if you are not familiar with Zapier. Okay. Zapier is like crack for marketers, but actually I'll let you give your lightning pitch on what Zapier is.
Zapier sits at the nexus of the SaaS web, so we connect SaaS APIs to other SaaS APIs and automate your workflow. So whatever that workflow is, whatever apps that you use, we connect it together for you. There are 1,500 apps that we support, and so there are millions of combinations. So pretty much anything where you have to take information out of one system and put it into another system, that's what we do for you. And we do this through a powerful but simplistic editor that allows you to not have to know APIs, but be able to take data that you get from an API, and we give you tools to do translations and filtering and stuff like that too.
We are heavy users of FirstMark.
Excellent.
And then can you comment on the team size that you're at today?
Yeah, so Zapier is about 240 or so right now. Engineering is about 90, and we're in about 20-something countries at this point.
And you're fully distributed?
Fully remote. There are no offices. We don't even do WeWorks. People can if they want. There's an office budget you can use for WeWorks, but yeah, no offices.
All right, great. And how do you structure the engineering org? So how do you, what is the team size, what's the composition, and
Sure.
what type of work are they assigned to do?
Yeah, so when I arrived at Zapier, we were functionally organized, so front-end engineers are on a couple of teams, back-end engineers are on a couple of teams, so the typical sort of way you start when you're building a smaller engineering team. What was happening, though, is that engineers were getting pulled off onto multiple parts of the product and kind of splitting their time between a bunch of things, and so we switched to a product-focused organization for at least part of engineering. The product-focused organization is run by an engineering, product, and design trio. The team sizes are anywhere from 2 is our smallest to about 8 or 9 is our biggest on a particular team, and they own a slice of the product. So like the Zapier editor is owned by a team, and the developer environment is owned by a team, et cetera, sort of multiplied by 12 or 13 teams right now.
And do the teams tend to be static or dynamic over time, setting aside attrition and new hires?
Yeah, well, so we just went to this new model a couple months ago. So right now, I'd say it's pretty static because we have our OKRs for the rest of the year, and there's a bunch of stuff we're trying to deliver because we have a variety of business metrics we're trying to move right now. But static forever is never good for an engineering team. So the intention is to allow people to move around fluidly, to create and collapse teams as new initiatives come up and old initiatives wind down.
Terrific. All right, so we're going to follow a little bit of the flow of an engineer who joins and works at Zapier, and use that as a way to examine a bunch of pieces of the hiring and management process. But to kick things off, I think one thing you're proud of that you've implemented is resume-less hiring. So I'd love for you to unpack what that means.
Sure. So I'm not going to take credit for this. This was here when I got to Zapier. But basically, we don't ask for resumes. People can upload them if they want to, but we don't really look at them. I don't think I've looked at a resume yet in all the interviews I've done so far. We ask for a LinkedIn profile if you have it. We ask you to submit answers to a bunch of questions that are generally technical in nature and situational in nature. We ask you to share some code, and that's really what kicks off the process. It's a little bit different if you get sourced. So if we source an engineer or a leader from somewhere, sometimes we skip some of that initial screening because it's a bit of a sales process, like we're trying to get them interested. But for people that come in through the pipeline, that's how they apply.
And of those dimensions that you mentioned, code sample, questionnaire, is there one that you really lean on most heavily when you decide to do a screen?
Yeah, so I should finish the rest of the front end of the pipeline story. So what happens after that submission is the recruiter, we have a team of technical recruiters, of course, and the recruiters take a look at the body of work that's been submitted and the career history of the candidate, and they say, we think this person's is a potential fit for Zapier. What happens right after that is a job fit call. So you probably experience this as a hiring manager call. Your hiring manager will be the first person to make contact and have a conversation, and that's a gut check, right? So there's a little bit of technical, a little bit of situational, a little bit of cultural that we're kind of looking for, which I'll come back to in a little bit. And then once they pass that bar, they go right into the tech screen. And the tech screen that's the most important part of what we do. Every person at Zapier that applies, whether they're sourced or not, ultimately ends up in some kind of take-home assignment. So if it's a front-end or back-end engineer, there's a specific technical assignment for that. If it's a security engineer, there's a different assignment for that. Leadership has to do it too. So for the directors that I've hired, it's more of a org design situation. Like here's a product, theoretical product. How are you going to structure around this theoretical product to build an organization? For security, there's a great security test, that presents a worst case scenario and ask them to respond to it. And even for me, so when I applied, I presented to a group of people across the country. I taught them something. The instructions were come and present anything, but present it like you're teaching, and I had to do a 30, 60, 90 plan as well. So every person in the company does this kind of take home, and this is the best part of the assessment because you get a good sense of how the person thinks. They get to build it in their own time with some limits, like we do time box the work, but they get to, in their own time, be creative and help us understand how they think.
And can you give an example of the take-home assessment you'd use for, say, a back-end engineer?
Yeah, so we're a Python shop, so it's a Python-focused test that they have to do. We're actually expanding that right now because while Python is certainly popular, it's also still a little bit niche compared to other technologies. So we're expanding the back-end test so that people can solve it in multiple languages right now because we're trying to get some diversity of back-end engineering thinking.
That's great. All right, so we've got initial screen, we've got take-home assessment.
Yep.
And then presumably an additional series of interviews. But one thing you mentioned that's especially interesting is this idea of a cultural bar raiser.
Yeah.
So I'd love to talk about that.
So I'm sure most of you would say that you have really strong company cultures, right? That they're codified somehow. Zapier is no different. Zapier has a very, very strong company culture. I'll rattle it off really quickly for you, but we're default to action, default to transparency, empathy, no ego, growth through feedback, and don't be a robot, build a robot. So the last one is obviously automation focused. The other ones are really, frankly, they're life behavioral traits. Like if you could do those 4 things in life, you're going to be a good human being. But we also want, the company culture at Zapier is really wrapped around those 5 values, and we spend a lot of time making sure that we hire as best as we possibly can against those cultural values, because everyone behaves that way. Everyone treats everyone else with extreme respect. There's no place for prima donnas. There's no place for the kind of political nonsense you see in a lot of companies. That if you've ever worked in a bigger company, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's just no place for that. Like that just gets in the way of doing business and getting things done. And so this cultural interview is, first of all, it's done by someone outside of the department. So it's not engineers doing this for engineers. It's done by somebody outside of the department. And they ask a series of questions to get at those 5 values, and then they score you on it.
Can you give one example of a value and question pair?
Yeah, so transparency is a good one. We are shockingly transparent is the only way to describe it. I thought I was transparent as a leader until I got to Zapier and like, holy crap, I've got stuff to learn. So, and as an example, the entire data set that we record in our data warehouse is open to anyone through Looker. Thanks Looker. Anyone can run their own looks, their own reports. The company financials are open to everyone. We're not public, right? So we can share that. So anyway, super transparent. So the questions will be. It depends on who asks the questions, but like I'll talk about. I'll kind of sneak around to this question, like not openly say, how transparent are you? Because that doesn't work. Like, it's more like, tell me about how you like to communicate. How do you like to get information delivered to you? Tell me about examples where you feel like you were excluded from information, just to get situational stories about how they view transparency and how they think about it. And some people are right away, they're like, oh, I love transparency. And other people, you kind of have to fish it out of them. And you're looking for both a desire for it and a tendency to think, how do I be more transparent in how I communicate?
And just staying on the culture and values for a second, I feel like a lot of companies go through an exercise of establishing what their values are, then they file them away and never talk about them again. Or they say they screen for it in interviews and never do it. Or they write it up on the wall, but that's kind of it.
So it's a poster.
In what other ways do those values manifest how do you remind your team what the values are for Zapier?
Yeah, so the way you see it is people will say, so default action, the first one I mentioned, that just means don't sit around and talk about it, do something. Even if it's the wrong thing, do something and say, I had to do something because no one was acting, right? That, the way you see that is you'll see a Slack message and say, hey, I saw this thing, I defaulted action, and here's the solution I took. I'm not totally sure it's right, but I wanted you all to know that this is what I did. Transparency is talked about constantly in the organization. Why aren't we being more transparent? Like when we rolled out the growth framework and talked about compensation, there were a ton of questions about compensation transparency that came up. So the values, they come up in our, we have an internal, it's like Yammer, except it works. It's a good tool.
Sounds great.
But we have a tool like that we use internally and everybody writes every week. And so you'll see a lot of discussion inside of Async, our tool.
That's great.
This. Yeah.
Cool. All right. So we've interviewed. We've been hired. Yep. Now I'm posted up at home with my dog, and I'm starting to work for Zapier. One thing that I think you've talked about a lot, the responsibility you have as a manager of a distributed team, is combating a feeling of isolation.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about some of the structured and unstructured ways that you have made sure that those distributed folks feel like they're part of a bigger cause and a group of friends.
Yeah. So there's a pretty good list here. The first thing is we do in-person retreats twice a year for the entire company. And we schedule someplace nice. I'm not going to announce the next one because it's still a surprise. But the next one, we're doing something in early winter or January-ish time frame.
Does it rhyme with Texaco?
It does not.
Oh.
but people are going to be excited about it because it's going to be a fun, kind of resorty place to land. So we do that twice a year. We do a departmental offsite as well, once a year. So that's sort of 3 times that you're going to get together. You're guaranteed to get together. We do all company Hangouts weekly, and we're still small enough, 240, where it's just a giant Zoom call, and there's multiple pages of heads in it, and people know to mute. There's someone who's on the mute button if somebody's not paying attention, the background noise, and they'll go in and mute for you. But it's very conversational. So first half is company stuff, second half is AMA, and whoever was presenting just answers a bunch of questions. And again, in the vein of transparency, the last one we had was around the company survey, and there was some stuff around feedback and wanting to get better at sharing feedback and feeling like they couldn't say the things they used to be able to say. And Wade, the CEO, got absolutely grilled by the company, just question after question after question, Slido about this and that, the other thing. And the feedback that we heard afterwards was, only at Zapier can we have this kind of conversation, in public and have all these really hard discussions, right? So that's another thing we do. We have these fun channels in Slack that cover all sorts of hobbies and stuff like that. There's the usual stuff, caffeine and beer and pets and whatnot. There's also one that I really like called Fun Mental Health. It sounds a little like an oxymoron, but people go in there when they're having a rough day and they say, I'm having a rough day. Like I'm having trouble getting started. I'm feeling totally overwhelmed by my to-do list, and other people will talk to them about it. And so when I showed up, I started posting stuff in there. I would find an interesting article on Medium, and one of the pieces of feedback I got was, it's really nice to see an executive in that channel. And since then, I'm not personally taking credit for this, but we've all been kind of ratcheting up our, here's how I'm feeling this week kind of thing, to sort of set the example that you're supposed to talk about this stuff. So that's another thing we do. But probably the most important thing is there's an element of self-discipline you have to have when you're in remote life, where you have to take care of yourself. There's only so much that this environment can do for you, and that means you got to know when to shut down so that you're not working 24/7. You've got to schedule IRL time with people in your life, right? You know, friends. For me, it's leaving my house in Milton and going into Boston and hanging out with people that I've worked with in Boston, like stuff like that. You have to be really diligent about it, or you'll get lost really quickly.
And how about organic interaction? So you talked a little bit about structured ways to get people to interact. Like how do people have those organic moments, the water cooler moments?
Yeah, so we have a general channel in Slack, like everyone else does, that is really more of that water cooler thing. We have a fun channel where the fun channel has all the comedic stuff. The general channel is a little bit more interesting. I still have to structure this, so organically bumping into someone that's hard to do, like in a remote environment. But I personally schedule skip levels with all the teams on a weekly basis. Not all the teams every week, but a couple of teams per week to go through the entire organization and making sure that I'm talking to everyone, and not necessarily about work stuff, like trying to get to know people more personally. And I tell them, look, I'm terrible with names. If I don't do this when we get together the next time, I'm not going to remember your name. That's going to suck for me because I'm going to feel terrible. So, but if we have these casual conversations because of that, and you start to get to know people's hobbies and what they like to do for fun and that kind of thing. So all the leadership has their own sort of ways of doing this, creating these moments. But the reality is there's always a certain amount of structure to it, because it requires someone to either reach out on Slack or someone to schedule something. It just, you just don't.
Unless you use donut.ai.
So we do have Donut as well. So, and we have
they're in the crowd.
Yeah, we have we do have Donut. We do have the coffee talk sessions that are scheduled too.
Cool. Let's turn to a slightly different topic: career ladders. Okay. So I think most organizations, when they reach a certain size and scale, reach a point where they need to start rigorously defining what great work looks like and how you progress both within an individual contributor track and a manager track. And it's becoming so common, I think every company has to do it by about the time you hit 75 employees or so. Mm-hmm. So would love to hear a little bit about what your ladders look like. Okay. And then I had one more question for you on that topic as well.
Yeah, so this is one of the first things I worked on when I got to Zapier. The ladders aren't revolutionary. Like, it's the standard eight step ladder that you would have from a Radford data set or an option driver data set. One of the things we did is we put the entire trajectory in place, even though we aren't going to need some of those steps for a while, but just sort of painting the entire picture, because we want to communicate to employees at Zapier, like, this is what your entire career could look like. This is how we describe an entire career of an engineer or a manager or a support person. Or we did it across the company, not just in engineering. One of the things that's a little bit different about how we worked is we've been diligent about not over-titling on the career ladders. There's a little bit of a market tendency right now for like the senior engineer title to be applied a little bit earlier in the career ladder than historically maybe it should have been. And we're, in a sort of our empathy, no ego vibe, we didn't like over-titling. So that was a little bit of a challenging conversation, talking to people that you're level 3 and you're compensated, you're well above market compensation-wise, so you don't have a comp issue. You're in the right level for your experience base. We're calling that engineer, not senior engineer, and getting people comfortable with that. The other thing that's really important is that we have equivalency levels for manager and engineer, starting at level 3, which is a little bit lower, so that you think of it as a team lead instead of a manager. And level 4 is where manager and senior engineer start. We use the same compensation curves. We're very explicit about that, and that starting at 3 and going all the way down to 8, there are comparable titles. So we want people to understand that you don't have to take a manager track, it came up earlier today, to make more money or whatever. In fact, it's actually better there are more opportunities to grow technically than in the manager ladder, because the manager ladder requires that there be a space for a leader, right? A new team that's being formed or something like that. And those just don't come up as frequently as, the possibility that you continue to grow technically and can become a staff engineer or something. So I've been trying to be really explicit about that.
And on the IC side,
Yeah.
how many competencies do you have in your ladder?
We have too many, honestly. Yeah. So we got a little carried away, me and Brian, the CTO, when we first put it together. We have 10 competencies listed. We really want to get it down to probably about half that, and then some of the competencies actually mirror the company values, so we can kind of collapse those into the company values and then cover them. But they're all the usual things like execution and quality and communication and stuff like that. Like they're the things you would expect. And one of the things we try to do, if you've seen Medium's snowflake tool, that little radar chart there where you can give yourself levels and it tells you how you are in the competencies, we mentally had that model when we put it together. And one of the things that Medium did really nicely is they had examples of behavior in these competencies, so that instead of just saying you should communicate blah 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 to these types of people, you actually have specific examples of this is what it looks like in this particular case. So we're still a work in progress though. Like it's not 100%. Like I said, it's too big. We need to collapse it down.
That's great. All right, let's turn to process and then talk about performance management.
Great.
So on the process side, your Agile shop, it's a mix of Scrum and Kanban.
Yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned in our pre-brief call was a Slack-based stand-up, and I've heard about these before. What does that actually look like? What is a Slack-based stand-up?
Yeah, so to set this up, there are some teams that have, the team is basically on 24/7, right? They have coverage. If you break up the globe into, say, 3 regions, they have coverage over all 3 regions. It's not ideal. That's probably another topic we can talk about in a little bit. But that's how it's set up right now because, again, the teams have grown organically. So we had to get better at asynchronous style communication because of this, especially on a couple of teams that have this. So it's just like a regular stand-up. When you get in the morning, you put, here's what I did yesterday, here's what I'm doing today, do I have any blockers? And everyone, as they show up online, starts posting that. And so you get some teams use a separate channel for it in Slack. That's just their stand-up channel. Some people put it in their regular team channel, but that's basically how it shows up.
And do you review all of those messages yourself every
Me
morning?
personally, no.
Okay, you trust the frontline managers.
Yeah, I mean, like anyone else who uses Slack at a moderate-sized company, you can't possibly keep up with all of the material on there. So
Right.
I trust the managers to do that.
That's great. Actually, random question while I'm thinking about it. Do you guys use email internally?
We do not. We do not use. There's never an email sent. We use email to talk to the outside world. So if candidates come in, mostly I get vendor spam. Honestly, none of you
Or speaking
other
invitations?
people, yeah, other people do it externally. but yeah, we do. That's how we talk to the outside world. But no one sends email, and it's wonderful. It's so nice.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
All right, that's a whole nother session.
Yeah.
Let's talk about retros quickly. So retros are a synchronous exercise for you, and you do them over Zoom. So what's the format of a typical retro look like for you?
So retros are more traditional, like what you would expect from an agile retrospective. We've been experimenting with Retrium, the tool, a retrospective tool, which has got tons and tons of exercises to keep retrospectives interesting. Because if it's more of same of less of or happy crappy or whatever, if you use the same ones over and over again, it gets boring really quickly. And the point of retros is to find the problems and figure out how you're going to fix them. So most of the teams do this over Zoom. They really have to, because it's a discussion that has to happen. And then they document what they learn. They document action items, the typical retrospective style.
Well, thank you. And then let's turn to performance management. First, let's start at kind of a team or an organization level. And so one of the things that you'd mentioned was there are 2 metrics you particularly focus on for understanding organizational productivity. If I understood it right, it was flow rate and waterline.
Right.
So can you share a little bit about what that means to you?
Yeah. So Zapier is a very, very data-centric culture. We measure everything, as I mentioned earlier, including all the ticket flow transactions that happen in Jira. So we have that in our data warehouse, and you can run great reports on it. So we have some looks for the team that cover ticket flow rate. So advanced Kanban is done looking entirely at flow rates. So you look at incoming and outgoing. you're looking at cycle time, you're looking at capacity of a team, and you're looking at trend of flow over time. So the first chart that you see when you go into this body of charts is flow rate over time, and it's a pretty information-rich chart. So you can see the gap between incoming and outgoing. You can see the trend line to see if, like, this is really common for service teams. They get too much work and they don't have enough people to deal with it. So their trend is going way up, like they're not able to keep up with ticket flow. So that's one thing that we're looking at. We still have velocity charts, like sprint over sprint velocity, but you can't compare those between teams. So it's really just for the team themselves to look at. The waterline is an interesting one. We're still getting this one right, but essentially what the waterline is supposed to show you is, of all the epics that you've got in your backlog, the stuff that you're dealing with at any given time is above the waterline, right? So what the discussion it's supposed to create is when stakeholders come in and they say, why isn't X being worked on? You bring up the waterline chart and you say, this is what's currently being worked on based on the capacity of the team. Is this the right priority? And then if not, you flip something up and you drop something else below the waterline. I do want to talk about one more metric though. We have, I had to ping our head of data right before this, because I can't remember the name of it. It's called a Kaplan-Meier Estimator. And it's a survivability metric that basically tells you how the probability of a ticket closing in a certain amount of time. So our goal, let's say we set a goal of we want 80% of our tickets to finish in 2 weeks in a sprint. Then you see this little curve, and you should see that 80-20 part right up here at that point. And it's a great metric of how well teams are closing out stuff when they get things done, and who's letting stuff languish, and whether teams are even sort of faster than the 80-20 rule. Not all the teams are using it yet, but it's a really, really cool statistic and easy to implement too. So check it out.
That's great. And then let's talk about individual performance management. So when we did our briefing call, I shared a thought from another CTO of a fully distributed organization, which was that you can't truly know if a distributed engineer is doing a good job or a bad job. All you can know is whether they've done what's asked of them.
Right.
And you pushed back a little bit, and you said that there are ways that you can think about it. So please share that.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. The first thing is just tactical. Like everyone has more work on their plate than they can possibly get done. And so the real art of working is prioritizing things, right? And saying that can wait, I can do this. And then if you get to the point where even after you prioritize, you still have too much on your plate, you're supposed to raise your hand and say, I can't do everything that's being asked of me. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that you need teams that can self-heal, right? So I can hear anecdotally that someone may be struggling through a couple of layers of management, but what really needs to be happening is the MVPs of your engineering organization are your first line engineering managers, right? They're the people that ensure the success of execution or the lack of success of execution. It's not the directors, it's not me, it's not the CTO. Like, that's the team that gets stuff done. So part of their job, and probably the hardest part of their job, is to find people who are struggling and say, you're struggling, how can I help you, right? And because if they don't do that, it doesn't matter whether I'm measuring pull requests or the velocity stuff I just talked about with you or anything. That doesn't give you the story, right? The story of why they're struggling, the story of where they're stuck, and that has to be solved on a person-by-person basis, and that's what the managers do.
How do you assess the performance of a frontline manager?
Yeah, well, the unfortunate truth about leadership is that it doesn't matter how good you are as a leader. It matters whether you get stuff done, right? Like this has been a perpetual painful learning for me in my career, and I think probably for many of you as you go through stuff and you really want to get this thing done on time, and all this other stuff happens, you don't get it done on time, and you feel terrible about it. So that's an opportunity for a conversation, though, rather than some people treat that punitively, and they say, well, you didn't get it done and you suck. But what actually the conversation, like I just had this conversation with someone this week. I'm like, you seem to be struggling to get anything over the goal line. You really seem to be stuck. I said, I think you have a bandwidth problem and you're trying to do too much yourself, but that's my assessment. I don't know if that's right. So talk to me about, here's what I want you to think about, and come back to me with, how your assessment of the situation, and then tell me how I can help. And he did. He came back and he said, here's what I think I can do, and here's what I think I can. So at the bottom, the short answer to your question is it really is about sort of outcomes, what they're supposed to be getting done versus what their team is supposed to be getting done. But that again requires that you have a clear set of OKRs, a clear set of roadmaps. Like you have to give people a chance to weigh in on what their outcomes should be, rather than just throwing stuff and saying you must get all this stuff done. So.
And this actually segues into one last topic I want to explore, and we can also begin to open it up for Q&A. The question, you mentioned you have a culture of feedback,
Yeah.
and I think that a lot of organizations would say that they encourage feedback, but I'm curious what you do to make sure that feedback is delivered, and when it is delivered, you train people on what good feedback looks like.
Yeah, so I think culturally we're better at supporting each other, so that makes it easier to have harder conversations, which is feedback conversations can tend to be harder conversations. We're still learning to do it though. I think especially as we've gotten bigger and not everybody knows everybody else anymore, it's not quite as tight-knit. Some of the feedback we're getting is it's harder to say controversial things than it used to be. Although from that last all hands, I would disagree with that wholeheartedly. but okay, but it's a feeling, and people are feeling a little bit like I just don't know everybody, and I'm going to say something that I don't like in a public channel, and so keeping everything public in Slack is the first thing. The only private channels we have in Slack are a couple of management channels and the hiring channels. So everything is public anyway. So you have to communicate publicly. The other thing that we're doing is the training that we're doing around performance reviews, which are coming up. We use Lessonly for employee training, and there's a Lessonly course around how to give feedback and how to have these hard conversations and how not to create the what sandwich when you're giving feedback, but instead just get right to the point and say, like, here's an example. I've observed that your team is struggling to execute. I want to talk about it and see if we can diagnose it together. Not really happy with this, and your team is not executing, and I'm really happy with this. Like that's the what sandwich, right? So we're trying to get away from that and just get to the really directed type feedback. But it's hard.
Well, Doug, I loved your answer to that question, but I had one tough question for you. What's the hardest feedback you've gotten as a manager, as an executive, that's actually changed the way that you do things?
God, just one. So it's been different. Each of my executive positions have been different, I think. And so the hardest, let me tell you the biggest learning I've had. It was sort of learned feedback, but the biggest learning is that when you come into an executive team, it's not the same executive team as the last one, right? And this is not just true of executives, it's true of any peer group that you step into. And so understanding what other people feel their roles are and where you fit into that is a really important part of the onboarding process. So for example, Brian is the CTO of Zapier. He's a fantastic person, that we're fantastic partners. And from the very beginning, our conversations were like, what do you want to do? What do I want to do, right? So when you guys get to this point, folks get to this point where you add a VPE and you've got a separate CTO, being really explicit from the very beginning about the different things that you want to do as part of your job, and then over communicating. Like my first executive position, I totally whiffed on this. I didn't realize that I was stepping on the toes of the founder right on a regular basis, and he struggled to give feedback. So I didn't know until the relationship had gotten to a bad spot. So that was kind of a negative reinforcement feedback, but. Yeah, that's probably the single biggest thing. There's lots of little things of learning, but that's a big one.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. Cool.
Awesome. We'll open it up for questions. And just a reminder, it's slido.com #TechSummit if you want to submit them via Slido. We've got a couple here on Slido. First one, what are a couple more examples of tech questions you're asking candidates while they're applying?
A couple more examples of tech. So outside of the tech test, is that whoever asked the question? You mean what are we asking in the skills interview, or what are we putting on the tech test?
Yeah, so you said you did some, you said you did some sample code, and there were some kind of leading tech questions that you were asking. What were those questions?
Oh yeah, so the initial recruiter screen. Sorry if it wasn't clear. The initial recruiter screen and fit screen just asks more generally about describe, on the screening questions, for example, talk through one of the thorniest technical things you solved, or one of the things you're most proud of that you solved. You can go on Zapier site and fill in one of these things. You can see our questions. That's one of those initial screening questions that we do.
Awesome. And also make sure, raise your hand. Great.
So I'm curious if you have any sort of like methods for looking for smoke when somebody might be suffering from some of the isolation issues you talked about, or some of the other eventual big problems of somebody being remote. I imagine you rely on the frontline managers pretty heavily for that, but if there's anything you can share from your seat that you look for, that would be great.
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't have any like definitive measurement. Like ideally, I think we'll get to this point eventually as remote companies where we'll have a collection of metrics that we measure, and if we see someone starting to ramp down on, say, Slack participation or PRs or something like that, that will start to raise a flag. We don't do anything like that today. So we really do rely on the team communication and the manager communication. I didn't mention this earlier, but one-on-ones are really sacred at Zapier. Like you have to do them every week. You don't get a pass on that. Like you have to schedule everything else around those things. With the exception of travel, say, or vacation, we keep a strong priority on that, and that's designed to just check on people and how they're doing. And the mental health channel, I think, is an outlet for that too. If someone says, I'm feeling really isolated, it comes up in the company survey. It's another area where we've seen it. But I'm not going to say we're perfect at it. I think it's hard to detect.
Hi, good afternoon.
Yeah.
So a question around remote is always the risk about somebody feeling left out than somebody on the team, perhaps who see each other more often and sort of have a better relationship. But how do you handle that?
Yeah, so the thing about fully remote is that it's not, there's fully co-located, multi-site, and fully remote. Multi-site's kind of the worst of the two because it combines remote and co-located, right? So being fully remote is kind of like being fully co-located because it's a level playing field. So you're not, and with Zapier, in Zapier's case, all of our channels are public too. So, and because of the Friday updates and async, like every possible piece of information you could be curious about is available to you. And you just have to go and dig it and read it. So I don't think we have a problem with people feeling isolated that way. I think it's more likely that people feel isolated. There's a couple of ways. There's just the human component we talked about earlier, and then there's also if you when you grow as an organization, people have to focus a little bit more. Like the early behavior where jack of all trades stuff that was discussed earlier today, that doesn't work as well as you start to grow and scale and have teams focus in specific areas. And for some of the folks, it's true of some of the folks at Zapier came out in the survey, they're feeling like they don't have, they have dilution of influence. They don't get to participate in as much stuff. That's a problem. And finding those people that are feeling that way and having a growth discussion with them about how they see themselves growing in Zapier and where we can help them. That's something we're getting ready to launch. We're working on building your own growth profile. This is something people also getting ready to launch that help people start thinking about this and then start communicating it so that the managers can respond to it and make sure people are sitting in the right seats. Because sometimes that's just, you need to go work on the services team instead of in your product team, or you need to go work on dev effectiveness. Like there are teams that touch multiple service organizations that touch multiple teams. There are other opportunities for roles, but we have to know that people are feeling that way.
Quick question from Slido. With a large and distributed team, how do you enforce consistency of coding and other conventions that can't be automated in a way that doesn't slow to a crawl?
We have coding standards. We have a bot that runs on a pull request to check to make sure you're following standards before it can get the pull request can get approved. There are automated tests that have to run successfully before your pull request can get approved. Those are some of the things that we're doing. Again, Brian put that in place. I'm just sharing you the information that our CTO already did.
Hey, so you mentioned one of your values is bias towards action or default towards action.
Yeah.
How do you further articulate those values so people just know really what that means? Because there are certain scenarios where you want to act immediately, and then there are other scenarios where you might want to do some research. And how do you help the company understand when it's appropriate to immediately take action? Because I find people interpret things very literally rather than sort of the meaning that we should all be moving forward quickly.
Yeah. So the most recent example of this where this has gone awry is that focusing thing I was just talking about, where we have certain teams now where like, we're saying to the leadership, can you please focus on what that team is doing? And they're saying, well, I really used to do all this other stuff too as a leader. Do I not get to do that? And my answer has been, well, yes, but that work is actually owned by our future CPO now. That needs to be somebody else. So in some cases, it's a little bit of a corrective thing. We say that's probably not something that you should be focusing on right now. Though I would say that, or the director would say that to a manager, perhaps. And that's a harder conversation because it feels like it goes against the default action value. That value is really more about if I want something measured, if I want something built, if I want to respond to an outage or something, like just go do it. Or if I want to spin up a document with some thoughts, like it's okay to go do that. But there are, we also use the DAISY framework, for deciding who's driving and who's contributing. When a bigger thing comes up that's going to require cross-team support, we just use the DAISY framework, and it's not heavyweight. We just say, hey, let's DAISY framework this. You're going to be the driver, you're going to be the approver. These are the contributors, and then people know, okay, that's something that I don't need to own. I'm just a contributor, or I don't even need to pay attention to it. Like the DAISY framework it gives you a permission to ignore things too, which is nice. So those are some of the things we're trying to do. I think we're still figuring this out as we've scaled. Yep.
Oh, hey, Doug. How do you deal with criticism and disagreements, either at the employee level or even in the executive branch? And it's hard enough when people can get in a room and talk in person. When feelings get involved, I imagine remotely this must be even harder.
Yeah. So we have a coach. There's a bunch of coaching, but let me talk about the teams first. There's a coach for individual team issues. So if this happens, like any other place, that happens when two people have a personality mismatch and they're getting in a Slack war, or they're going back and forth in Slack and not talking in person or whatever. When we get to something that starts to become intractable, that they can't solve themselves, the coach steps in. We have a personality tool, Berkman, that we use. There's a bunch of them, of course, but we use Berkman. And so the coach will often use Berkman to explain what's happening and then help people try to resolve it. The executives we all have reboot coaches, so we get our own coaching to sort of work through, our own things that we're struggling with. And the executive team operates very much like a first team. So we deliver tough feedback to each other. We deliver praise to each other. We're very transparent all the time. And we're, half of us are new, so we're still getting to know each other too. But it's really just a practice discipline that we try to do. But almost always, at some point, you need a facilitator. So if it gets to the point where you're stuck as humans, then that's when you get a facilitator involved.
There are a few more questions on Slido, but I think we'll call it, and I'll just toss it back to Dan.
Thank you. Doug, thank you very much. That was incredible. Appreciate it. Thanks.